My name is Charles Kapoor. I have the privilege of serving as President and CEO of the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce. And again, I'd like to welcome everyone for the start of our annual legislative series. You're in for an informative morning, and we're excited to have three of our wonderful local legislators here to give us their recap of the recently concluded General Assembly and an overview of the work that was done, especially that which affects those of us here in the business community. Today's event is produced in conjunction with the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce's Public Policy Committee, which includes our co-chairs, Mark Looney of Cooley LLP and Joey Musmar of Miller Musmar CPAs. I'd also like to extend special thanks to Mary Beth Koya from NVAR for her assistance in helping us curate today's panel. And as we like to do at all of our chamber events, we like to take a moment to recognize those organizations that support the chamber throughout the year with their sponsorship support in the form of their annual sponsorships. And we'll have that on the screen here, starting with our strategic sponsors. So thank you to the folks you see on the screen here, as well as our visionary sponsors. And then finally, our advocate sponsors. These great firms and organizations go out of their way, again, to support the operations of the chamber throughout the year with their generous annual support. And in regards to our legislative series, I'd like to highlight the organizations that have supported this program throughout the year with their sponsorships of the legislative series. Thank you to Comcast Business, Inova, Miller Musmar CPAs, Sandy Spring Bank, and Walsh Colucci, Lubley and Walsh. It is now my pleasure to welcome our esteemed moderator for this morning's presentation, Mark Smith, the Executive Director of State Government Relations at George Mason University. Prior to George Mason, Mark held several government relations positions at Virginia Commonwealth University and also served the Commonwealth as Assistant Secretary of Education, Executive Assistant for the Secretary of Transportation and Public Safety, Division Administrative Manager in the Attorney General's Office, and as a staffer for both the Virginia House and the State Senate Clerk's Office, which are responsible for the daily operations of the General Assembly. Mark, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you, Charles. I am truly honored to serve as the moderator for the Greater Reston Chamber 2021 General Assembly webinar. Certainly a high point for my career to be on the same virtual stage with such distinguished legislators. One other matter that I should mention is I believe that the bios for our legislative guests are posted on the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce website for those that are interested. And we are fortunate that the panelists have agreed to a 90-minute format, a long time for these folks to commit to us this morning, but it should allow ample time for questions and answers. So as Charles mentioned, please use the Q&A feature. So how about if we start with 3 to 4 minutes of opening comments from our panelists. And Delegate Plum, I'll start with you. Delegate Plum serves in the 36th House District, first elected in 1978, representing a portion of Fairfax, which I think we all know includes a portion or includes Reston. Ken is sometimes referred to as the Dean of the Northern Virginia delegation. And on a personal note, I have to share that as a young staffer for Attorney General candidate Jerry Beliles, I can remember campaigning with Ken in Reston in 1981. Ken, it's really been suggested that the regular and special sessions in 20 and 21 have been transformative in Virginia. But appreciate your insight and reflection on the impact of the recent legislative action.
Well, thank you, Mark, and good morning to you and to my colleagues from the House and the Senate, as well as members of the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce. My association with the Chamber goes back a long, long time. When I was first elected in those early years, the business community in Reston had no organization, and so I organized a small business advisory committee, and I hope a member or two of that committee might still be in the audience today. But to make a long story short, rather than just advise me on state affairs, the group was interested in forming an organization, and the Ignition Committee that became the Reston Board of Trade, as it was called in the early days, was formed, that now became, of course, then the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce. So I've always valued the input from the business community, the uniqueness of the business community and the needs in a growing community. And needless to say, the Reston's quite a bit different from the 1980s as it is today. What a dramatic change we've enjoyed, and what a wonderful community it is that I'm honored to serve. I serve on the Appropriations Committee. That's the money writing committee, along with Delegate Reid in the House. And we have the task of figuring out what the priorities are going to be in our expenditures. I chair the Agriculture, Conservation, and Natural Resources Committee. The Agriculture Committee is all those people who make sure we have food on our table. And incidentally, agriculture is the largest industry in Virginia. We also deal with the Chesapeake Bay, and the Chesapeake Bay I call the barometer of our environment, how well we're doing in maintaining a clean environment. I also serve on the Communications, Innovation, and Technology Committee. It's an outgrowth of a committee that I chaired in its early days. It was called the Commission on Science and Technology. I serve also on the Public Safety Committee, dealing with such issues as police and guns and so on. And I serve also on the Agricultural, Natural Resources, Public Safety, and Communication. Well, I guess I've covered them all. But the thing being is that in those committees that we do the grunt work of figuring out what legislative we should pass. I'm proud of the fact that Virginia is coming into the 21st century in a big way. We're looking at a community that is changing. We have in our Reston community one of the best educated communities in the Commonwealth. We've faced a particular strong group of challenges that are different somewhat than the rest of the state. Part of our challenge has been to always figure out how it is that we can sit in Richmond and govern a Commonwealth as complex as that runs from Southwest Virginia all the way to the Hampton Roads area to Northern Virginia and the Golden Crescent of Northern Virginia. But it's an honor to serve, and I look forward to your questions and comments today.
Ken, thank you very much. Now, let's turn to Delegate David Reid. David was first elected in 2017, taking his seat in 2018, representing a portion of Loudoun County. And as a Broad Run High School alum, we're thrilled to have David represent us in the area. David's leadership talents really propelled him into some pretty significant roles in the General Assembly as a young member of the General Assembly. David, really appreciate 3 or 4 minutes of your time, some opening comments. Maybe you can add to Ken's thoughts on the transformative legislative sessions that we've recently experienced.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks very much for the Reston Chamber for having us here today. Just to kind of give a little bit more additional detail on kind of my background. So I represent the 32nd District, which, as Mark said, is the eastern portion of Loudoun County. Much like Delegate Plum, I also serve on the Appropriations Committee, so it's really very beneficial for those of us here in Northern Virginia to have a couple people on the Appropriations Committee, because that is where we deal with the $143 billion budget that is the 8th largest budget in the United States for state issues. And so we're able to actually have significant influence on that and being able to actually address the financial needs of Northern Virginia. I also serve on the Transportation Committee, which again is very important to Northern Virginia, and Privileges and Education and Privileges and Elections. Sorry. One of the other things is because I think of over my 30 years of experience of having worked in the Northern Virginia business community, I'm also the House Democratic Caucus Business Liaison. And recently I was appointed to be the chair of the Manufacturing Development Commission. So many of you probably recognize that it's like really difficult to be able to get new businesses to come into Virginia. And one of the roles that I want to actually see us do with the Manufacturing Development Commission is work on business retention. And so I've asked myself and the other members of that commission to identify places where we can go and visit those manufacturing entities within Virginia and find out what their concerns and issues are so that we can address them proactively, as opposed to finding out that they're leaving through a press release and then having difficulty addressing it. So I think some of the things that we've addressed in both the current session as well as the previous special session is that, of course, COVID-19 has been one of the overarching concerns during that entire time period. And early on, we were looking very much at being able to address the healthcare crisis portion of the pandemic. And then as we got to the regular session in 2021, we were really able to start to address issues related to the economic recovery that is needed. And so I'm sure we'll talk about these things later, whether or not it's the tax conformity issue or the Rebuild Virginia program or the G3 program, all of these things that were done with an eye towards being able to set up Virginia to be able to recover and come out of the pandemic in a much more strong position than we were when we went in. So I'm glad to be here, and I look forward to the questions and the comments today.
Right. Thanks so much, David. Next, it's my pleasure to recognize Senator John Bell. John was first elected to the House in 2016, representing a part of Loudoun and part of Prince William. And then he was elected to represent the 13th Senate District in 2020, started in the 2020 legislative session. The 13th District also represents part of Loudoun and part of Prince William. And as best I can determine from the map, he too represents the Broad Run high school area. Senator Bell, we really do appreciate you joining us this morning. And I suspect that you have your perspective on the transformative actions of the General Assembly in 2020 and 2021. And right now, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark. And it's a pleasure to be here with everyone and my good friends, my colleagues from the House. It's an honor to be here with you all to talk about the sessions and where we're at today in Virginia. I will tell you the good news is Virginia is strong, and all the indications are that our economy is outperforming our projections. And we have frankly rebounded quite well. We've been able to continue to put money into reserves greater than we've done in the past even, and that is going to have a huge impact going forward with protecting our bond rating, our AAA bond rating, and really the status of Virginia. Going into this session, personally, I felt the most important things we could do. Number one, make sure that we do everything we can to make Virginia as safe as possible, get these vaccinations out, and do everything we can to help children get back to school and people get back to work. Going along that line is then setting the foundation to help businesses get back to full productivity and really rebound. We know several parts of our economy have been hit very hard, and I think responding to those and helping them out is critically important. There were a number of things we focused on this session. For me, I did a few bills that were really in response to issues that businesses have come to me with. And while we're here, I'll just invite you, if you have things that are causing you problems in your business or headaches or things we can help with, we'll provide our contact information before the end of the session, but please let us know, because the best legislation I've done in my now 6 sessions in the General Assembly is when people have brought legislation to me. I did one this year called Alcohol to Go, and it was really a lifeline to restaurants, our distilleries, wineries, farm breweries. These are fast-growing businesses of Virginia that have been hit very hard by the pandemic. And the governor had an executive order to allow them to do sales to go. ID protections, all the same protections in the store are actually present with this product of to go, with the person making the delivery checking the ID. It's been working really well for us. We haven't really had any incidents with it. Around the country, it's worked well. So I did a bill that would make that extend it for at least another year. And then we have some studies before then and hopefully make it permanent. And that's really in direct response to these businesses. I did a tourist improvement district bill. We have business improvement districts already, and allows businesses, if they voluntarily choose to join them, to contribute and then allow them to use the money that they are able to take as an add-on to do advertisement and do things to enhance their business. And this is solely dedicated to tourism, which is one of our hardest hit areas through the pandemic. And I think this will be quite valuable. It's been very successful around the country. One I suspect we'll get some questions about. Myself and Delegate Reid were very involved with the Dulles Greenway bill. This is something that, frankly, people of both parties have worked on for well over a decade. And we were able to finally get a bipartisan bill passed. I think it's going to do a lot of good. I did some legislation on absentee voting, and I think that will also help that going forward, as we suspect have more of that in the future. Committees I serve on, I was on the Appropriation Committee when I was in the House. It was hard for me to leave that, my favorite committee over there. I now serve in Commerce and Labor, and it has a lot to do with keeping the businesses running and really our labor laws and what we can do to set the footing for Virginia. I also serve on General Laws, which is trying on the cats and dogs of anything legal that doesn't make it to the Judiciary Courts Committee, local government, and then also privileges and elections. With that, I'm also excited to answer your questions and love to hear what's on your mind.
Thank you very much, Senator. Charles was very kind in his introduction of me, and quite frankly was very respectful in terms of not making me feel older than I actually am. But this past General Assembly session was my 42nd regular session in one capacity or another. And I have to say, it's been my observation over the years that each General Assembly takes on its own personality. The 2021 session was no exception, and particularly with the overlay of COVID. For me, the word that comes to mind in terms of the personality of the 2021 session is flexibility. The members, the staff, the advocates, the constituents needed to be very flexible in dealing with virtual meetings. Dealing with virtual meetings, a lack of informal communications like hallway conversations and receptions, just how the House and Senate organized, whether it was virtual or in person, the restriction on the number of bills that members had and the like. And what I would like to do, and maybe we can start with David, is ask each of the panelists to describe in a few words how they would characterize the personality of this recent session.
So yeah, thanks, Mark. I mean, that's an interesting question, and I would say that I would probably describe it as challenging, mainly because it was a different environment, although we did have the special session during the summer and fall that allowed us kind of be able to cut our teeth in figuring out how to do this. But keep in mind that during the summer and fall, we only had 5 of the, I believe, 14 committees operating. So when we went into the regular session, that meant that we really had to kind of up our game and be able to do that. And I think what kind of came out of this is that for myself personally, the idea of having a 7-bill limit in the House, I thought was really very beneficial, because I think it forced us to focus on doing more quality legislation as opposed to quantity. And I know, at least for myself, that also meant that I spent a lot of time in advance working with the stakeholders to try to be sure that we had a 90 or 95% product ready to go by the time it got to the subcommittee. Because I think, I like to borrow, I think it was a quote from Eisenhower that said, "No battle plan survives first contact with the enemy." And I've kind of changed that around a little bit, that says, "No legislation survives first contact with the subcommittee." And so therefore, I was trying real hard to make sure that I had a 90 or 95% solution. So I think that made me and others work harder on having really good quality legislation. I think one of the really great benefits of doing the virtual environment, and this is one of those things that I think we all recognize, that there are some things that happen during COVID that are going to allow us to continue doing these things afterwards. And the ability for people to be able to dial in from anywhere around the state and be able to actually testify on behalf of legislation without having to make a drive down to Richmond. Now, for those of us from Northern Virginia, it might be a couple hours, but folks from the southwest part of the state might be 5 hours. And if they get down there and then the legislation gets delayed until the next day, then they're going to be angry about the whole process. So the ability to be able to actually remotely dial in and be able to provide their testimony, I think, is a really great benefit. So I think we ended up with more people providing input. We had a greater variety of input. And I think we passed some really good legislation, because I think the smaller number of bills forced us to focus on some very specific topics.
Thank you. Senator Bell, we've got flexibility and challenging. How would you characterize the personality of this last session?
Definitely schizophrenic. I'm joking a little bit, but I mean, it was. I think we really did. Our staff did a fantastic job of working the technology challenges to allow public interaction. And I think that's critical. Normally, as you know, anyone can come and testify on a bill, but since we can't all be in person, it's really difficult. So the Senate and the House had different approaches. The House was pretty much all virtual. In the Senate, we did sort of a hybrid. The Senate members met in Richmond. We couldn't meet in the Capitol. We met in the Science Museum, which was large enough to allow us to social distance. And then we had a virtual ability for people to present bills from the House and also to testify on bills. So it was kind of it was challenging, but I think it allowed a good interaction. I will tell you though, I miss the interactions when we're in person. and frankly, wearing masks. You can't read the nonverbals from everybody in the room. And often, we do have technology challenges even with our best efforts. So it makes it difficult to get that Q&A back and forth. And I feel like that makes better legislation the more interaction we have. The General Assembly, we serve the people. So having the people, business owners, constituents involved testifying is critically important. But I think, frankly, we again, hats off to the staff for making this happen. When we went into this last year with the special sessions, it was a big unknown. I think they did an amazing job. And thanks for everybody who had to wait on the line sometimes for lengthy periods before your turn to testify came up. I really appreciate people hanging in there to do that, because I know it was a little cumbersome, but very, very critical to going forward. And I think this just shows the resiliency of our processes and our commitment to making sure that the Commonwealth continues to run in a top-notch manner.
Great, thanks so much. Delegate Plum, we have flexibility. David, you said challenging. We got a tongue-in-cheek schizophrenic. Maybe you can bring it home and tell us how you would characterize the personality of the session.
Yeah, I think I would characterize it as being responsive. And I suspect that some of the folks who are looking at this webinar are probably astonished at how amazed we are about webinars and virtual meetings and so on when you've been doing it successfully for years. But, we started back in 19, so we don't change very quickly. But the pandemic forced us into making a change in the House, for example. If you put the House members, 100 of us, 6 feet apart all around, it filled up the basketball gymnasium at Virginia Commonwealth University. So the practicality of us being able to meet in person was simply not there. Where you're seeing me today is where I spent the last 6 weeks. Sometimes, most days, 7 o'clock in the morning is when my Zoom meeting started. And some days I actually sat here until 7 o'clock in the evening. Now, of course, I had time to run downstairs and get something out of the refrigerator or run to the bathroom, but otherwise I was engaged. I like the fact that people were able to interact with us, I think, in some regards, in a broader way than when they had to drive to Richmond for the reasons that David and John have mentioned. It allowed us to respond. I put in the original legislation that set up the Joint Commission on Technology and Science. And what I said at that time is that we need to see how it is that technology can enhance democracy. And frankly, I think that's in part what happened here. When we go back to, quote, normal, I hope we will be thoughtful about how we, quote, go back, because it is a circumstance that what we learned were some things where we can be more efficient. Limiting the number of bills, for example, makes a whole lot of sense. Some folks threw a lot of spaghetti on the wall to see what would stick, but it tied up a lot of committee time doing that. Now, when you have to be more thoughtful and responsive in terms of the bills you put together, I think we work more efficiently. Likewise, I think it is the case that and I trust that folks who are listening on the line, and certainly I know some of the folks who participated in planning this today, know how it was that we were able to have a waiting room, not unlike you have here, and to invite people from the waiting room in to talk to us and have a back and forth, ask questions and so on. So I believe that in terms of responding to a critical issue, that being the COVID pandemic, affecting our business community in a major way, affecting our schools in a major way, and our families being upset by it, so on, that we were able to once again say that we're going to continue as a Commonwealth, and we'll do it a little differently, but we can still do it in a way that democracy prevails, that small d democracy prevails, that people can in fact be involved with, and so on. And as you're demonstrating here today, used to be I'd go up to the Hyatt and we'd have a nice breakfast meeting, and I enjoyed that. And that when we get back to it, let's be able to do that some more. But in the meantime, we can effectively also use technology to enhance public participation. So I would say responsiveness.
Very good. Well, Delegate Plum and Delegate Reid, you both anticipated my next question, and I'm going to ask it in the event, particularly for Senator Bell, if he wants to add on to it. But in a typical 46-day short session in recent years, the General Assembly entertains about 3,000 bills and resolutions. And this year, because of the bill limit restrictions, there were slightly more than 1,500 bills and resolutions. I guess maybe I'll twist the question so all three of you can weigh in is, do you see the tighter restriction on the number of bills that you can introduce in the House and Senate continuing? And are there any cons? We've heard a little bit about the pros on the bills, but are there any cons on continuing such restrictions?
Am I going first this time, Mark?
You know, how about if we start with Senator Bell?
In the Senate, we did 12 bills, and that was our limit. Our House partners were complaining we had too many, I think, but there's 40 of us. You do the math; they had a lot more bills coming out of the House. My Senate district is by far the largest in Virginia. I now have about 265,000 constituents. It's a little over 30,000 bigger than the next closest one. So 12 bills was tight. And I actually had to make decisions at the end of which ones I wasn't able to do this year. And part of it, I will tell you, I usually reserve several bills for Loudoun and Prince William County to make sure that any legislation they need, sometimes it's housekeeping bills. And frankly, this is something that I applaud the whole delegation. We're able to go through the delegation and make sure someone is typically able to carry those bills, and we had to do that at the last minute. Having said all that, I do think the bill limit is a good thing. You know, there are some people, I mentioned no names, Senator Scott Saravel, who do 60 bills a year. And I think that's too many. And frankly, I think we have a very good committee system. And I'm a strong believer in the legislators' Hippocratic oath, first do no harm. But when we have too many bills, especially with complex issues that can have many unintended consequences, I think mistakes are more likely, and I think it can be dangerous to have too many bills. A friend of mine serves in the Minnesota Senate. They meet for 5 months a year, much longer than us, and they do half the bills we normally do. So I think if we look at other legislatures around the country, we'll see the bills, we have quite a few, and most of them do bill limits, which ups the quality. And as Delegate Plum said, it really makes people think hard about, you know, what they want to put in, and hopefully, you know, take away some of the things that are really on the fringe, are not ready for prime time, and have not been well thought out. A bill typically, in my experience, unless it's an easy fix, but it's very complicated, it almost needs a couple of years of seasoning so the stakeholders can really dig in and get involved. And I think that makes much better legislation by doing that. So I'm a fan of the bill limits. We can debate over what the right limit is, but I think a bill limit is probably a really good thing for us.
Thank you very much. Delegate Plum, I know you've already weighed in on this. Was there anything else that you'd like to add?
Yeah, absolutely. And Mark, I'd like to emphasize to our viewers that, you know, we're legislators year round. We talk about what we do when we go to Richmond, but we need to talk about what we do when we're back home. And what we do when we're back home is to work with our constituents. And sometimes the remedy to a problem is not a law. In fact, sometimes the law may actually make things worse. So what we need to do is to have an ongoing dialogue with the chamber and with individuals to say to people, what are the issues that we're dealing with, and what is the appropriate remedy? By that, I mean sometimes a regulatory remedy might be most appropriate, so that our intervention on behalf of a constituent in a regulatory environment may be the better solution. It might also add to the flexibility, because if you go to Richmond and you introduce a bill, unless it's special legislation, which requires a greater vote, it's going to try to stretch its provisions from Southwest Virginia to Hampton Roads to Northern Virginia. And in order to do that, sometimes somebody gets shortchanged by you when you average it out. So I invite a continued dialogue and a conversation over the years to talk about what challenges do we face, and how can we, number one, figure out if an executive action might be appropriate, and number two, if legislative action might be appropriate, how can we do what David Reid was talking about and work carefully on those bills with the appropriate committees and so on in the interim. For example, David and I are both on appropriations. We meet monthly throughout the year. I chair the Joint Legislative Audit Review Commission. We meet monthly throughout the year. And so that we can work on those bills. And when we come in then, in that short time frame we have, we can be more efficient and get more work done.
Again, Delegate Reid, you weighed in on this a little bit. Is there anything else you want to add after hearing from your colleagues?
Yes, Mark. I mean, there's a couple of things that both Senator Bell and Delegate Plum mentioned that I think really kind of bear some additional highlights. One is that the idea that we're part-time citizen legislators is really much of a misnomer, because as Delegate Plum pointed out, we're down in session for either 45 or 60 days, but then for the rest of the year, we're actually still legislators. We're working with constituent services, we're listening to concerns and developing ideas for legislation for the next session. And one of the things that I think all of us recognize, and this is where the bill limits kind of have an adverse effect, is that sometimes some of the best ideas for legislation are those ideas that come from constituents where the government is not doing what it is that it was intended to do, and we have to make changes. But by the same token, there is a great benefit to being able to have the bill limits and actually force people to work together. And I'll give you an example. In 2018, based upon the request from the Loudoun County School Board, they wanted to do away with the King's Dominion law, which prohibited them from being able to start school before Labor Day. Well, when I showed up with my version of the bill, there were 7 other delegates from across the state who had a bill similar to that. Now, if we all had a bill limit, then that would have forced us to reach out, communicate, work together, and decide what one bill we were going to go forward with, because that particular issue is a nonpartisan issue. And in the end, when that bill got passed the next year, it was because Delegate Roxanne Robinson was carrying it. I worked with her. We worked with both the Democrat and Republican senators and delegates to get it passed. And that's a real good example of how you can actually all work together to be able to achieve something. And you really don't need 7 pieces of legislation doing the same thing.
Very good. Well, I have to say, we will look forward to finding out what the right number of bills in the House and Senate are for next year. That kind of wraps up what I had in mind in terms of the general operations of the General Assembly. I'd kind of like to turn the focus now to specific matters that each of you have taken on in your respective roles. And Senator Bell, if we can start with you, quite frankly, I think by most accounts, you had an incredible session. You've got 8 out of 9 of your bills sitting on the governor's desk right now. And while you are going to be remembered for extending the alcohol sales for restaurants curbside service during the pandemic, you touched in your opening comments on a matter I'd like to hear a little bit more of, and I think the audience will too, is some insight on your passion for Senate Bill 1259, dealing with the Highway Corporation Act, or I think you referred to it as Greenway. Senator Bell?
Yes, thank you. Definitely the alcohol to go, monumental for Virginia, game changer. I'm kidding. It goes right hand in hand with my my dogs and winery bill I did a couple of years ago, and the alcohol sales and advertising bill. I didn't necessarily want to be the legislator to focus on these issues, but I'm here to respond to my constituents, and these are needs that they have. So kidding aside, the Greenway, you know, if you go back to the history of this, it was really the first public-private partnership in Virginia. And if we're honest about it, frankly, none of the people serving today had anything to do with the creation of it, but it was pretty short-sighted when it was created. And I don't think people anticipated the massive amount of growth in Loudoun County and how important that corridor would be. And then the other parts that I think were short-sighted was what happens if the owners change hands and debt is increased as it does. What impact could that have to the commuter? And unfortunately, we've seen very high tolls on this road, and it's a one price regardless of how much you use. Some people use the first 2 exits. That's where Delegate Reid and my constituents mainly use. The one exit's a quarter mile, and they're paying $6.50 for a quarter mile, and it's either that or 45 minutes of traffic. It's a choice no one wants. So pretty much since the creation of this road, people from both parties have worked on this and done a variety of different pieces of legislation. I think we all wanted to do something to make this better for our constituents. And Loudoun County has sued the Greenway and fought in the rate cases a number of times. And frankly, they've been pretty unsuccessful in doing so with the way that the agreement was forged. So what we did is we were able to take lessons learned from these many pieces of legislation. And also we had an SEC examiner's report that was brand new that gave us a roadmap of what the SCC, the State Corporation Commission, really needed from us in legislation that would give them the framework to basically do a good evaluation. The State Corporation Commission mainly regulates public utilities. And this is an odd thing for them to have to look at as a toll road. Normally that's done under VDOT and federal highways. So this is really a different kind of a challenge for them. So they needed some specifics for us, and we were able to put legislation together in a bipartisan way. One of my former opponents, David Ramadan, is a private citizen, one of my constituents now, worked very hard on this with us. Republican Supervisor Matt Letourneau was right in there with us. Everyone in the delegation worked on it. As I said, Delegate Reid and then Delegate Suhas Subramaniam carried the bill in the House. It was really a team effort to get it done. And what we'll do is we defined what growth would have to be that, so if any toll increases were proposed, then it would be, we define what impacts it would have on traffic movement in a way that frankly, we think will give the SEC the tools as they've requested to evaluate this fairly. We've also done protections against taking additional debt on the road. This is one of the things that frankly is a way to, unfortunately, basically push the balance sheet in a way where you're going to get toll increase every year. If you take on more debt, you leverage the road, then it will show that you're not making the money, and then frankly, you can get a toll increase. So we put limitations on taking on new debt. We also put limitations and protections in for credit ratings. So if there was any kind of a deal, we'd make sure it's not a junk bond deal that would provide more security for, again, constituents. So we did a number of things to put protections in. And lastly, they can only do toll increase requests for 1 year at a time. In the past, there's been 5 and 10-year requests, and the amount of growth was very confusing. Loudoun County has 30 people a day moving to it. So growth increases for 10 years out are complicated, hard to predict. So what we did is we took that off the table. We believe this will actually give a framework where we can look to do the things in the future that we really need to do, and that's look at distance-based pricing, and frankly look at the 28-mile corridor of not just the Dulles Greenway, but also the Dulles Toll Road, and try to come up with good solutions for both. So it's a complicated subject. Sorry if I'm taking a little bit too long, but this was a very important piece of legislation and one that so many people worked hard on. With that, I don't know if Delegate Reid wants to add to this, because again, he was a very integral player in this entire process.
So I think, Senator Bell, you've covered it, I mean, in great detail. I mean, and again, you really highlight the fact that this has been a problem that is at least 20 plus more years in the making. And one of the issues that we have had here is that I remember when I moved out to Ashburn in 2000, that the cost of the toll was $2, and now it's $6.65. So, I mean, that's a 300 and some odd % increase over that time frame, which is significantly higher than inflation or anything else like that. So again, we have to be able to get this under control, because I have gone out and when I've been talking to constituents in my district, is that they will tell me that they will spend $300, $400, $700 a month on tolls on the Greenway and other tolls. And quite honestly, it kind of goes back to a period of the 1990s when I think at both the state and the federal level, they chose to stop funding transportation. And so the only way that you were going to be able to build new roads was through this particular public-private partnership. And at that particular point in time, it seemed like a good idea, but many of those things that Senator Bell pointed out weren't taken into consideration. And then the rates just really began to skyrocket. So I think he's really outlined what the bill does and what the intent is that we're hoping to achieve, but that just provides a little bit more background on what's driving us to be able to make this an important issue.
Thank you very much, Delegate Reid. I have to say on behalf of the Greater Ruston Chamber of Commerce members and a number of other folks, we appreciate the leadership that each of you have shown on the Greenway, and quite frankly, the larger Northern Virginia delegation. I think we're seeing some benefit from that. Next question that I have is for Delegate Reid, and clearly I've have a chance being in Richmond to watch how you ably represent your constituents. I would appreciate you taking a couple of minutes to discuss your passion for electric vehicles and explain the impact of House Bill 1850, which relates to the weight of vehicles powered by batteries, and House Bill 1979, which deals with an electric vehicle rebate.
Yeah, so thanks, Mark. So this is one of those things where it's like we've done a lot really of really good things over the past several years about being able to try to get carbon out of other parts of the economic sector. But the part that still has the ability to be able to get the most carbon out is the transportation sector. That still makes up about 48% of the carbon that goes into the Virginia atmosphere. And so we can make the most gains by being able to address things as they relate to electric vehicles. So the one particular bill that you're talking about, which increases the EV semi-truck weight limit by 2,000 pounds, this is very similar to what we had done before in the past, where if you were buying a semi-truck for being able to haul big loads throughout the state of Virginia, and you were going to actually add in and do natural gas, the vehicle, the actual power unit, could be heavier. And so batteries take up more weight than the traditional diesel does. And so therefore, we needed to allow this to be for the heavier weights to actually, for them to be able to work on Virginia's highways. Now, one of the kind of good benefits of this is that Volvo has also announced that they are building their electric vehicles in the Dublin, Virginia plant. So now the trucks that are actually being built in Virginia will be able to be driven on Virginia roads. And so that's what this does, is this allows for that higher weight limit to accommodate for the battery that's going to be in the power unit. The other one, and this really goes back to the comment that Senator Bell said earlier about the fact that sometimes legislation needs time to kind of percolate or season over a period of time. So the electric vehicle rebate bill is something that originally I introduced in 2018 as the classic tax credit. And as a tax credit, it meant only people that were earning enough money were going to be able to take advantage of the tax credit. That then evolved over time until what we have today, which is going before the governor, which is a tax rebate that would be cash on the hood, as the dealers like to call it, for people that are buying both new and used electric vehicles. And that's really kind of a game changer, because in the past, these were only available for new purchases. And the other thing that we did to be able to address kind of the equity issue and make sure that this is just not going to wealthy individuals who are going to buy an electric vehicle anyway, is that $2,500 would go to individuals who are just going to be buying an electric vehicle. But an additional $2,000 could be going to an individual who is 300% of the federal poverty level or less. And that means that they could potentially get $4,500. And if it's applied to a used vehicle, that means that they could go to CarMax. And if the car was going to originally cost $20,000 for a Nissan Leaf, they might now be able to get it for $15,000. That becomes a real serious game changer, and that puts the ability of somebody to be able to buy an electric vehicle in the range of a much broader economic spectrum than it has ever existed before. The other thing that we have to take into consideration is as we get electric vehicles into people's driveways and into their hands, the overall total cost of ownership is less. I will freely admit to you that I have a Tesla bought at the end of September. And because of that, I've not bought gas since the end of September. That means that there is money going back into my pocket, and the same thing could apply to that couple who is at that 300% federal poverty level, that they're not going to have to buy gas or oil or other things like that. And so not only do we make the electric vehicles more affordable to a broader spectrum of people, but we actually put money back in their pocket every month that they are an owner of that. And so that's the reason why this has been so passionate for me. It's not only to address the environmental side of it, but it's also to address the economic side of it.
Thank you so much. Very helpful. Next question is for Delegate Plum. Ken, no question, you've had a considerable success over your career. You've had a long-term impact on education, business, children's services, the environment, to name a few. But this year, I noticed that you had introduced a bumper crop of K-12 budget amendments. It looks like many of them came out of some JLARC studies, Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee. But I think our webinar participants would appreciate understanding how your collective amendments are going to help our young people in the K-12 system. And as an add-on, I very much appreciate you drawing our attention to what you think the benefit will be of the 5% pay raise for our K-12 teachers. Ken?
Yes, certainly, Mark. And I want to say before I go with that question is to say that all three of us drive Teslas. So we're into the electric car thing in a big way. And it starts off being an environmental issue. But we also have to recognize over the long haul, it becomes a financial issue, which we still got to grapple with along the way. But I was a co-patron on those bills and happy to be so. It turns out that my district starts where the Greenway starts and my district ends where the Greenway starts. So I have less of a direct interest, but I certainly have the Dulles Toll Road to work with. So as I've indicated before, I chair the Joint Legislative Audit Review Commission, and that is, in simple terms, it's the GAO of Virginia. We take a look at government operations and programs, and we make recommendations to how they might work. Over the last couple of years, we've done exhaustive studies, and we have about a 30-member staff of professional researchers, social scientists, economists, and others who do these studies for us on a staff level. We've looked at our educational system, particularly as it relates to children with special needs. And I know that there are families in our community who can relate to the fact that sometimes we don't do as well as we might in those programs. I might say very quickly, though, that in Northern Virginia, we really have some excellent programs due to the fact that our Fairfax County and our Loudoun County also gets high priority, as our citizens do, to good education and subsidize the programs at a higher level than some localities might be able to do throughout Virginia. And what we found was, not totally surprising, was that it depends on your zip code. It's the kind of level of service you get if you're a child with special needs. If mom and dad decided to go in a central Virginia and live, you get one level of service. If you go into the hinterlands, it might be different. And it really is not a constitutional way in which we need to do business. We need to make sure that our children of all abilities throughout the Commonwealth have equal access to educational opportunities. So what you see in a series of budget amendments that were introduced this year as budget amendments, because they're a transitional kind of a process that will ultimately, I think, be codified, but we will give the Department of Education and Department of Social Services and others who have a say in how our schools are operated to get their feet wet in terms of making some transitions. It is the case sometimes that children's behavior is such, or their needs are such, that we cannot accommodate them in a regular school setting, and we go to private school settings and buy services. Again, what we found was that the whole range of opportunities or lack of opportunities across the Commonwealth. And so some of those budget amendments relate to a coordination and a monitoring those programs to make sure, again, that our children have access to the services they need. Also, again, the special education needs of our community have grown, and parents who are involved with the individual educational plan know how, on the one hand, that can offer a great sense of hope, and on the other hand, it can be a real frustration. So what we've done with some of those amendments is to require a greater level of preparation on the part of administrators and teachers in the preparation of IEPs, and taking a look at the range of services and where we need to add services to be able to respond to those. What we hope will be the outcome of this will be a strengthening of our departments through these budget amendments that will give some additional resources specifically to these needs to make our school systems, in fact, more broadly responsive to the range of children's needs. What I find in Northern Virginia is that we're the best educated communities, not just in Virginia, but really throughout the country. And parents have an expectation, as I think we all do, and certainly as business people do, that we want our schools to be the very best. And the way they become the very best is that we provide the proper programs and funding to make that happen. That's a part of what this thrust was all about. And I'm pleased to say that as it worked out with budget resources, we're going to be able to move forward on these programs. And I hope you will find your parents and so on in your community and those of you who are employing our students who are coming out of our schools, that we've made a marked difference. In terms of teacher pay, we have lagged behind for years. We have never quite recovered from the Great Recession of 2008, and teachers have borne the brunt of that in terms of their pay. What a number of people, including the governor, and certainly the legislators, came to recognize is this was a particularly challenging year. And I know parents who are listening understand what a challenging year it is, because they had to pick up the slack when it was the case that for public health safety reasons, we had to close our schools for a period of time. That with the vaccine and so on is going to work its way out. But in the meantime, we have teachers who have had multiple preparations, multiple efforts at trying to respond to people, to instances where some of the students were in the class for part of the time. All the students were also virtual part of the time, so that the challenges were great. So we were faced with one hand that we were way below, 10% below the national average in communities that were the wealthiest in the nation. And you can't really, I don't think, justify how well we are as an economy, the 12th largest state and the 8th wealthiest state in the union, that we would have our teachers lag so behind the national average. So as a consequence, there was a consensus coming together that we needed to dig deep and we need to do something right by way of our teachers. And I'm pleased that we've done that. And I have to express also appreciation to those people who are in the teaching profession who have bent over backwards to try to make this complex system that we had to kind of put together as we went, because while we knew about pandemics, we really didn't know the full implications of pandemics until we got into them. So a lot of people had to be flexible. A lot of people had to work extra hard. And that hopefully that pay raise in part will say, we respect you, we appreciate what you've done, and we want the best and brightest in working with our children, and let's have that come about. So again, that's what it's all about, to try to take a school system, particularly in Northern Virginia, excellent schools, and make them even better. Our children are our future. We can't shortchange them. And our teachers are the people who deliver, and we want them to be the best and brightest.
And thank you very much. And I appreciate your leadership and leadership of the other panelists on that very important subject. I'm noticing here that we're probably down to about 15 minutes left in the panel time. And I do want to make sure that we reserve some time for questions and answers. So while I've got second questions for each of you, I've got a couple of other business related questions that I'd like to jump to. And then if we have time, I'll go back to the other questions. I have to say, I think one of the pleasant surprises and shining spots looking through the COVID experience that we had this year is that the business community truly did continue with its strong advocacy, even if it was virtual. Not only were there virtual lobby days, but there was strong presence of the business leaders at the various committees and subcommittees. And the business community raised a number of subjects, some that we've already talked about, but one that comes to mind is that 1% proposed tax on health insurance provided by some employers, and support for the governor's G3 community college proposal, which was mentioned earlier. And quite frankly, in a strategic move, the business community started getting very involved with the budget process of suggesting budget amendments to support international trade, economic development, the G3 program, the Main Street program, some other talent pipeline programs that should produce some good fruit. But another matter I think that caught the attention of the business community was the legislation providing tax conformity for the Paycheck Protection Program. And I know that until the final hours, the House and Senate had differing positions. I'd really like to ask each of you to provide us your thoughts on the significance of this bill, and maybe if you're able to share some inside baseball on the negotiations and how you came to your compromise. Senator Bell, how about if we start with you?
Yeah, I was a very strong advocate for frankly I would love to see us have done all of the forgiveness on this money. But I'm really happy we were able to do 100,000. I know there was a very big difference between the House and the Senate on this. And you know, but the way I look at it is I'm a small business owner, but small businesses who were facing the unprecedented challenges of the pandemic and took PPP money and were able to pay their employees and frankly use the money for what they were supposed to, which means they don't have it anymore. They didn't buy equipment and do things to enhance their business, they spent it. So to then charge them a tax on that, a 6% tax, I think is very unfair. $100,000, that forgives basically, if they had a $100,000 loan, $6,000. You know, if those above that would have a tax liability for that. Having said that, I think what we did was it was a good compromise. A good compromise means there's some things that somebody don't like. And the way we did it was 75% of the businesses who receive PPP loans in Virginia are covered by that compromise. So we were able to get the vast majority covered. So I think we really did a good job of that. And then in fairness, the House championed a number of other things that will help businesses that, while it may not directly forgive PPP, they're going to get assistance in other areas, which will provide benefits for them. So I think that we did a good job on this. The sausage making isn't pretty, but the sausage hopefully tastes good in the end. And we often look at things as multiple bites to the apple. And frankly, there are sometimes disagreements on several different issues at the same time. And I think we work well to try to get those. But if we do have a windfall of money, or as we look to the federal money that's coming our way, I would definitely be in favor of forgiving all of the PPP money, because again, if businesses did the right thing, they spent that money, they didn't benefit from it, they did exactly what we asked them to do, and I hate to see them pay a tax on that. Thank you.
Delegate Reid, your thoughts on tax conformity and any inside baseball you can share with us?
Yeah, sure. And Senator Bell brings up a really good point. And one of the things that I like to often highlight, and especially when I'm talking to the high school civics classes, is that you have to realize that both our Constitution as well as the process is intended to drive us towards moderating compromises kind of in the middle. And so while the House started out with one number and the Senate started out with another, we came up with this $100,000 number. And I think the average PPP loan that had been taken out in Virginia was $107,000. So that really kind of speaks to Senator Bell's point about the fact that this covered 75 or 80% of the actual PPP loans that were taken in Virginia. So we kind of knew that going in, but at the same time, some of this is a negotiating thing to be able to actually achieve some of the other goals that we had in mind. And some of those included the $120 million for the Rebuild Virginia grant program and the significant investments in broadband, because one of the things that we realized about broadband, and here's one of the things that I like to tell people, is you have to remember that the stuff that you see in the budget is about priorities and a vision of what you want Virginia to be. So some things, like let's say the tax conformity, is something that is a really immediate need. But by the same token, the $100 million that we're investing in broadband, you won't see it actually pay dividends tomorrow, because you're going to actually have to dig up places, put fiber in the ground, and bring that to it. But it's a recognition of us that we need to be able to make this available, this, for lack of a better term, almost utility type of requirement available to the great majority of people across the Commonwealth. And so we're able to make those investments as well. And likewise, the money that we put into the G3 Community College program to be able to allow people who are adversely affected by the pandemic to be able to actually get retraining, get certificate programs or two-year degrees, are all things that are geared towards the fact that we want to be able to be sure that Virginia's economy is as strong as possible as it can be when we really fully start to come out of the other end of the pandemic. So the $100,000 for the tax conformity is one kind of part of a very kind of multifaceted approach that we took to being sure that we were strengthening the Virginia economy so that it would be ready to kind of really flourish after the COVID-19 pandemic. And the sausage making that went on, as Senator Bell said, I mean, there's a lot of compromises. By doing this, you get this or you don't get something else. But again, our Constitution and our process is really intended to drive us towards a moderating kind of compromise in the middle that most people can agree with.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate that insight. Delegate Plum, and your thoughts on the tax conformity and where we landed?
Yeah, I think where we landed was a pretty reasonable spot. Sometimes, rather than state the case, the question is the best one. The questioning is the best way, and that is for a business owner. And I had this question posed to me, who had to take out a loan, one of the federal loans, in order to survive, and use that money in the business, not personally. Why should turn around and have to be taxed on it which just further aggravates the situation when they're already in the pandemic. So it was absolutely essential that we conform the bills in a way that we granted relief to those people who were involved with the loan programs. The question was coming to the number. If we talk long enough today here, we talk about programs that we didn't fund, because the fact of the matter is the limits on what we could spend money on are it's limitless. I mean, there are lots of things we could do a better job with mental health programming and so on. So you make decisions, and when you make decisions, some things are included and some things are not included. And that's what happened with the trying to arrive at the conformity thing. My gosh, it was it was tempting, I'm sure, to those people who were involved with those negotiations to hang on to that $100 or so million because we could buy some other good stuff with it. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that's an unfair tax on a group of people through no fault of their own. So that was not satisfactory to do. So absolutely essential that we reach some kind of compromise. And that's when the legislature works best, when we see a range of needs and figure out how we can. And it's not a political party thing. It's not Democrats or Republicans. That's so often used as a simplified way of saying how things go right or don't go right. But it's a group of people who are really wanting to make sure that we did right by the Commonwealth. And that's, I think, is about as good of outcome as we could have expected.
Thanks so much. Question for all the panelists, and Ken, how about if we start with you this time? If you were advising the business community on a single area to focus on with respect to state policy or legislation going forward, what would that be?
Well, I don't know if I would say that I could tell the business community what ought to be your priority. I'll say this about things. David has already mentioned the G3 program, and that is a great program for getting businesses into the Commonwealth and getting unemployed and underemployed people into work. It's a win-win for us all. It's a win for our economy, and it's a win for our people in the Commonwealth. Low and moderate income children will be able to attend these community colleges essentially for free. And what they'll be trained in is what the demand is in the workplace. Can't beat that kind of arrangement, doesn't seem to me. So what we can look towards will be the instances in which we can find out where there are win-win arrangements for the broader community as well as for the business community. Sometimes it's a case that when we talk about environmental things, people like to pit business community versus the environmentalists. And I would suggest to you that's another area in which I think we ought to gather together in a virtual room or in a real room and look at what it is that we hope to accomplish. I don't think anybody wants to live in a community with dirty air and dirty water. In fact, I'm sure of that. And that includes business people. They don't want to do business in communities like that. So how can we reach mutually agreed upon conclusions? I think we need to call upon science more. The ability of science, and we always say about climate change, well, follow the science. That science proves that there's climate change, but also it's science that can recommend solutions. So in the business community, there are ways in which now businesses are increasingly defining ways that they can help to clean up the environment. And so in instances where there seems to be that conflict, to the degree to which we can, as responsible individuals, work together to work those out, it's to our mutual advantage. It's a win-win thing. And so I like my role best, I think, sometimes when I become the arbiter, I guess, the negotiator, the person in the middle to try to bring together diverse interests and work out a community-wide solution that everybody can agree on. Not always possible, but we ought to work with that goal in mind.
Thank you. Senator Bell, if you were advising the business community, what area of focus would you suggest on policy that they look to?
Well, I really liked Delegate Plum's answer and agree with the majority of what everything he said. I'll say that I agree with workforce development. It's important to have a good communication and partnership where we're investing to develop skills. And I think we're doing a great job of that with some of our partnerships, particularly in the cyber world and the technology world, where we're helping people to either reposition themselves from one career path to another, or to use the G3 program to get the training education they need to get a job. So I think that's one thing that's very critical. Another one, clean energy is an area that we have changed our policy in dramatically over the last couple of years. And I would like to see Virginia not just be a participant in clean energy, but be a leader. And I think this is a 50 to 100-year opportunity for Virginia. And I think this is something that we should grow on as much as possible. And then the last one, I think, is our participation in the technology career fields going forward. Amazon's announcing the Northern Virginia headquarters, I think, is a massive game changer for us. I'm very happy New York decided they didn't really want that, because it allows us to get a much bigger piece of that gigantic pie. These are great jobs, averaging $150,000 a year, and that's taking out anyone with a salary over $800,000. So basically it wouldn't be skewed, and that doesn't count benefits. So these are great jobs. But the real game changer there is we've been losing some of our great Virginia Tech, UVA, and other technology grads to Austin, Texas, Silicon Valley. Even though we had one of the largest job producers for tech jobs, many of our graduates thought they needed to go to those areas to have a fulfilling career in technology. So I think the Amazon announcement here is a game changer, because it changes the mindsets of students to know they have a great career path here. And I think anything we do to enhance that, to keep these Virginia graduates in Virginia. So I think anything we do to partner in that as we go forward, because we know the need is great. Cyber need is great, and other technology needs. And the more we can partner to do that. The last thing I'll say is, please give us your feedback when we're investing in areas where there are no jobs, where there are no needs. Because frankly, I find nothing more frustrating than that. I was very upset when I found one of our community colleges was still offering a travel agent program, because frankly, I think most people do their own travel booking now. That's a very small field. And the worst thing I think is to have a student get sold a hope, and sometimes even get student debt in an area where they're not going to get a job. So I think the best thing we do is be honest and have the open lines of communications. And again, I appreciate the great work you've done, Mark, at George Mason and the Job Creation Center we have there, because it's very exciting. And with the 2+2 program, we've got an opportunity for students to really do things to maybe live at home or go to community college or dual enrollment in high school and lower the cost of a college degree. So all of these things, I think, are tremendous partnerships for us going forward. And the more we communicate, the better off we are. Thank you.
Delegate Reid, in the final minute that we have in this portion of the webinar before the questions and answers, what would you like to offer in terms of advice to the business community?
So Mark, this is a really good question. And this is something that has really been very important to me for my entire time in the General Assembly. And I'm going to kind of echo a little bit of what Delegate Plum and Senator Bell have already said. And I think some of what we need to focus on is those things that are infrastructure enablers. And so those, meaning the business community, those are things that relate to transportation, broadband, and education, because all of those things are the things that actually enable us to be able to have businesses come and flourish here in Northern Virginia and across the Commonwealth. But if I were to pick one thing, and it's not on this particular list, is that I think the number is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 95% of all venture capital is actually given out in California, with a great majority of that in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, we all recognize, I believe, that with the efforts that we have here with the federal government, with some of the large tech providers that are coming to Virginia, and some of the great research institutions that we have in the state, that I think we're right to be able to take a much greater role in that venture capital and be able to actually have some type of small business incubator that is going to be the place where the next Google or the next Microsoft or the next Apple can actually flourish here in Reston or in Loudoun or someplace like that. So what I would be asking of the business community, and this is where we kind of go back to the discussions that we've had throughout this entire thing, is tell us what we need to be doing so that we can actually address both the legal and the regulatory framework, so that we can actually be a venture capital destination for high tech, for biotech, for health, and all of those different type of things here in Northern Virginia and across the entire Commonwealth.
Thank you very much. We've had a full conversation this morning. I really appreciate that. The one thing that you spared yourself was my final question, because I was hoping for crystal ball in terms of your predictions of the upcoming statewide elections in November, but we'll save that for another time. Really appreciate the opportunity that the Chamber's provided me to serve as the moderator of this webinar. I have to say that we are very, very fortunate to have these three individuals representing us in Richmond and taking time out of their personal lives. And personally, I want to thank Senator Bell, Delegate Reid, and Delegate Plum for taking their time and sharing their thoughts with us this morning. As we've suggested, there would be a question and answer period, and I'd like to turn the program over to Alicia to coordinate that. And again, thank you.
Yes, thank you all so much. We have had a few questions come in. So the first one is from Joe Ritchie. And the question is, what was the General Assembly able to do to help address the Metro Rail funding issue and to open and keep open the Silver Line Phase 2 stations?
Well, I'll kick that off if I might. And Joe Ritchie, good to hear from you. You and I go back, I guess, about late 1990s when I organized the Dulles Corridor Rail Association that became the advocacy group for the extension of the Silver Line. And you will recall then the opposition from so many people who thought it was going to be superfluous. It wasn't something we could need. And then you take a look at what happened in the corridor to realize just what an economic engine it has been. I moved the Dulles Corridor Rail Association activities over to the Northern Virginia Transportation Alliance when we finished Phase 1, because it looked like we were so successful on that Phase 2 would move right along. I can tell you I hardly drive out that way anytime without gritting my teeth to realize what's happened to stall Phase 2. Apparently there's some construction issues that have been, I believe now, finally negotiated. For a while maybe they were in legal matters, but now the expectation is Phase 2 will open, I believe, in July of the next year. That's, or I should say September, I believe it is. That's a couple of years past the time that we had hoped to have that. And to see that infrastructure sitting there not used is really too much. The Metro funding we resolved in the budget cycle last year in terms of coming up with Virginia's share for Metro funding. That issue will come up again in succeeding years. And I want to say that I continue to support mass transit in a major way, because it's already been pointed out in our discussion, transportation is our #1 polluter. And the ways in which we can get people to use mass transit and so on keeps our communities clean. It keeps our citizens happy. And I believe it keeps the business community happy because all that housing we're building now and all those businesses that have situated themselves around the Dulles Corridor speak to the importance of Metro Rail coming to our region. So stay tuned. We will continue to work with Metro funding as the next cycle comes forward. I believe as the COVID pandemic and the restrictions related to it subside, we'll see a resurgence of Metro Rail use, but we need to continue to view it as a critical part of our infrastructure for our region.
And just to confirm, that was September 22. That's the outlook for the opening.
So Alicia, because I just had a briefing on this at the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, and so I believe that the plan is right now is for MWA to turn it over to WMATA in September of 21. I think we kind of lose track of time because like we just got out of session and those type of things. And then I believe operational ridership would begin hopefully in early 2022. But to Delegate Plum's point, that's at least a couple of years behind what we all thought it was going to be at one point in time.
If I can say one thing on this as well, I'm on NVTC along with Delegate Reid, but we did in the second Relief Act from the federal government, the American Rescue Plan, the $1.9 trillion plan, there is actually $30.5 billion for transportation. And as that money gets divvied up, I think that's going to be a much needed relief, because transportation systems, not just Metro, but all over the country are struggling. And to the point was made earlier, one of the things I've asked a number of questions about on the meetings is I think we have a public relations mission to let people know the metro is safe, and the cleaning and other things we're using on our buses and other commuting options in the area. Because to get back to a full economy, we're going to need all transportation options. We just can't work with everyone driving in once people are actually physically going back to work. So we'll have to partner together to restore confidence. I think that'll take some time, but I'm very confident we can do that.
All right, thank you. Any other comments before we move on to the next question? All right, great, thank you. So since reopening schools 5 days per week is critical to our workforce and training, can you please speak to the issue of school reopenings, the status of SB 1303, possibly describe the bill, and will there be waivers for jurisdictions? Also, will there be an emergency enactment clause?
If you want, I can take that one since it was a Senate bill. SB 1303 was not, first it didn't have an emergency clause on it. That would take a much higher vote count, and the votes just weren't there for that. But it did pass both bodies. It was amended a bit through the bodies. I posted on the chat the link to legislative services, and I think that was shared when I saw that question about how to go see the status of that bill. But the bill requires all school districts offer in-person and remote learning, and then the parent would decide which one they would use in the fall. In many ways, I think this is a messaging bill, because it originally started off, it had an emergency clause in it, which would meant right away. Frankly, I'm not sure I could have voted for that one, because there are many school districts that don't have the technology and other things to do that right away. And again, I'm back to the first do no harm. And I think we could have done harm. Without the emergency clause in that, it was a bill I could support. And I think it really gives the school districts the guidance they need. And at the same time, this was about the time it came out of the Senate, the governor announced his plans to get kids back in school in the fall. So I think it was almost anticlimactic once the governor's announcement was out. And I see school districts are taking actions that they need to do that. And again, the CARES funding that's coming, there'll be some of that funding to again give schools the additional tools and other supplies they need to do this in a responsible way. Some of the best practices are going to be cumbersome, honestly, but we've learned to live in a different world now. Hopefully, our vaccination percentages will be very, very high in the fall, and we'll be at or close to a herd immunity. But the school districts around the country that have done this successfully are out doing temperature checks as students come off the buses or arrive, and they're taking a number of precautions throughout the day, which in some cases takes additional people to do these precautions. But I know Delegate Plum's an educator. My mom was a teacher. This is something that we have to make sure we keep our teachers safe and that we don't put them in harm's way. And I believe right now we're on a good path to do that. But getting our students back to school, I think, is a priority we all share. And it's one that I believe we will accomplish in Virginia.
And Alicia, if I could just add something there, and this really kind of goes back to some of the things that Senator Bell and Delegate Plum were talking about earlier, and especially when Delegate Plum was talking about legislation having an impact across the entire state, from, say, Northern Virginia down to South Side, and from Hampton Roads over to Abingdon. And it's interesting because when you have discussions about school safety, then you start to realize that, okay, school safety as defined in Northern Virginia is a different definition than it is down in Southwest Virginia, where they would just like to be able to have the roof repaired so that they don't have leaks and they don't have mold growing there. School safety in some place like Richmond is that we'd like to be able to have doors that actually close and lock at night. And so this is one of those things where it's like, as we have this legislation that is rolling out to try to impact school safety as it relates to a pandemic across the entire Commonwealth, you realize this great disparity exists in the school's ability to do cleaning. Some of the classrooms for the schools down in Richmond are not large enough to be able to have children at 6 feet apart. Some of them don't have air handling units to be able to actually move the air around to prevent kind of the staleness of the air and the potential virus in there. And so that's where it's like what Senator Bell was saying, some of this money that's going to be coming from the federal government to be able to address some of these things are going to allow us to be able to actually hopefully upgrade some of those schools and address some of the pandemic mitigation measures that will be necessary. And this is one of those things that I like to say to people. It's like, first and foremost for all of us is that we are responsible for representing our constituents. But the title is state senator or state delegate. And so therefore our remit means that we have to be a little bit empathetic that things that go on here in Northern Virginia are not necessarily the same priorities that they are in Southside or Southwest or in Richmond. And we have to look at kind of a bigger picture when we're dealing with issues. And so that's the reason why we're going to need to be able to take this federal funding and the state funding that we put towards it and be able to make some of these schools better in places, outside of Northern Virginia to be able to handle the pandemic.
And if I may just chime in and maybe repeat what John and David have said already so that I can say that I've said it too. Let me assure you that your elected school board in Fairfax and Loudoun and throughout Virginia really want to educate children. They don't want to close schools. Their priority is to keep schools open. And likewise, for teachers who make it a lifetime career to work oftentimes at lower pay, they want to teach children. So there's some kind of conspiracy to keep the schools closed. And I know this is terribly frustrating to people that our children aren't able to go off to school every day. But be assured that there are people who use science to make good public health decisions to decide when it is that schools should open appropriately. And I believe by the fall, we're going to be able to meet that measure. But as David points out, the diversity of state is such to suggest that you can take one date and make that the date is not representative of what the factual issues are in terms of opening schools. Schools are going to open. School boards want that to happen. Teachers want that to happen. It's going to happen, but we need to make sure that we are good protectors of the public health. Let me also say back on the other question, it's September 2021. If I confused the dates as to when the phase 2 will be ready to turn over to WMATA 2021. Thank you.
Great, and thank you all for that information and insight, and thank you, Delegate Plum, for clarifying the date as well. So related to that, to the education, Delegate Plum, I know you were talking about the raise for the Virginia teachers. There was some discussion about that, and there was just a question if that's going to put us on par with the surrounding cities and states.
It gets us closer. And I say that because we were on the average about 10% down. And again, it's a matter of whether you're talking about Loudoun, I believe it has a little better rates than Fairfax now. Localities also put in the biggest share up here of the monies. Downstate, the state puts in the greater share of monies. And it goes back also to the economic development issue of why we want to make sure that the state is prosperous throughout the state. It's in part because we don't have to subsidize them then. I mean, we have been so generous and so wealthy, we have often ended up subsidizing some programs that if in fact economic development occurs in those regions, they can support themselves. So 5% moves us closer. I don't believe it gets us quite to the national average. I would need to verify that for sure, but it's one of those things where this is all incremental. We've been meeting every year since 16-19, and we're going to meet again next year, and we'll then be able to build on what we started this year.
Great, thank you. And we've got time for just one last question. And let's see. So the impact on the gas tax revenue is distressing. How do we address transportation funding?
You want, we can take turns at that one. I think, I mean, first off, this is a complicated issue. Originally, when the gas tax was put in there, it was based on a percentage, and then it had to change because gas prices went below any of the assumptions at the time. So there's been some tweaks on this. Having said that, with all three of us owning electric vehicles, even though that's still a low percentage of our total driving force right now of our cars, we know that there is a tidal wave of electric vehicles coming. So I think fundamentally we're going to have to look at a different way of approaching transportation funding. because if we rely on the gas tax and we've got all these vehicles that don't use gas, we're going to have to make sure we relook at that. I would like to see us also relook at, some of the interstate transportation and how we tax there. If you look at many of the fees we charge for those who go through our roads from other states, we're far less than the surrounding states. And yet those are, the rates Virginia businesses pay when they go through those states. There was a little progress made on funding for I-81, but we're still not where we should be. And I-81, we've got improvements there, but anybody who's driven that knows it's in pretty rough shape. And honestly, we have an aging infrastructure. Many of our bridges, overpasses are in bad shape. This is a problem I think we have to face because it's ultimately the future of our economy, and it's a safety issue. But I can't tell you we have this resolved going forward. I think Delegate Reid's legislation this year is going to help us prepare for that. And I think we're going to have to do many things to get on board. Our tourism industry, we need to make sure we have the charging infrastructure across Virginia for tourism and for commuters. But literally by 2025 and just a few years after that, the vast majority of new vehicles made are going to be electric vehicles. So we need to get a move on this infrastructure now. And again, the transportation funding is going to have a big shift. We do have a tax revenue that we get from new vehicles, and EVs are currently more expensive than non-EVs. But having said that, this is a challenge we're going to face going forward, and I do believe we're going to have to fundamentally relook at how we fund transportation as this shift occurs.
Alicia, I think Senator Bell really kind of covered it. There's no silver bullet. There's no easy answer to this. I mean, right now we know that transportation revenue, gas tax revenue is down because of the pandemic. And it's also expected that it will be impacted as more people shift to using electric vehicles. And there are several options that we need to consider. And there has been some studies that are being done on it. And as a matter of fact, I think in the transportation omnibus bill that we passed last year, which is going to include $3.7 billion over the next 10 years for rail and transit up and down the I-95 corridor, there are some pilot programs that are included in that to try to figure out ways to address this as we move forward. So there's a recognition that we don't have the answer right now, but we're working to try to find a solution. And I'd just like to go back to the earlier question because I had some notes here and I just needed to look it up on the average teacher salary. So in Virginia, we're at about, before the increase, we're at about $51,000 a year for the average teacher salary. Just over the river in DC, it's about 76,000, and just on the other side of the border there in Maryland, it's 66,000. So that really highlights the fact that we're not even at the average for kind of the regional area. And it's one of those things where teachers can probably say, I'm going to drive to make $10,000, $20,000 more, and they will still come out ahead. And we really want to be able to have those teachers, as Senator Bell said, not just with the technology folks, but we want to have those teachers that are going to the JMUs and the UVA and the Virginia Tech continue to teach in Virginia. And so we really do need to continue this effort, as Delegate Plum said, to kind of incrementally increase the amount of the pay to at least get up to the regional average, and that will help us be more competitive.
Delegate Reid, I think I heard you say George Mason in there too.
I did. It's just that it was broken up because of the audio.
And so finally, I will say ditto to all that. In terms of transportation funding, you buy an electric car, you're going to pay more for your registration because you're not going to pay the gas tax. That's one little short-term solution that makes up a bit of the loss of money. But over the long haul, we're going to have to look at transportation as being a social cost that we all contribute to, because some of us are going to walk, some are going to bike, some are going to have an electric car, and some are going to ride metro. All those together create social costs for which there's a response in the community in terms of a cleaner air community and so on.
Great. Thank you all so much for that information. And we are at the top of our hour. So Mark, would you like to give a few last remarks before Charles closes us out?
No, I think I expressed my appreciation to the panel members already. I think it's Charles' turn to close things out.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, so much. And again, our extreme thanks and appreciation to Senator Bell, Delegate Reid, Delegate Plum for joining us this morning and helping us kick off our annual legislative series. Thank you again to our partners at Comcast Business, Inova, Miller Musmar CPAs, Sandy Spring Bank, and Walsh, Colucci, Lubley, and Walsh for supporting today's program. Again, all of our attendees will receive an email with a link to this recording on our YouTube channel for on-demand viewing. And please continue to stay in touch with the Reston Chamber at our website, restonchamber.org, for updates on future editions of the legislative series. And as you heard from our leaders here, they want the interaction and engagement of those in the business community. So for our members on the call, if you have an interest in making your voice heard and taking a more participatory role, please consider joining the Reston Chamber's Public Policy Committee. Please feel free to contact our office for more information about when the committee meets. And again, thank you again, panelists, Mark, our moderator, and for all of our attendees for starting your day with us. We wish you the best in the day and the week ahead, and look forward to seeing you at our next Reston Chamber event. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.